last go in order sequence, and then we'll start mixing it up. We're just going to ask the panelists to talk about their involvement with the SDGs and any programs or work that they've been doing, really their perspective to sort of kick off the conversation. So, Sue.
Well, I'll touch on two things. So you're right. I'm going to give another shout out for employees for the global goals, hashtag employees for SDGs. But really, there clearly is a lack of awareness, and I think incredible opportunity for companies that are aligning their strategy with the SDGs to engage the employees within your workforce around that. I'd just like to pick up on the question around, I think it was from you, about the nonprofits. I think, actually, I did a webinar last week, so there was a lot of Q&A around this. I think there is a lost opportunity for NGOs that are not finding where they sit amongst. It's not just, the 17 goals, the icons here are very simplistic. The real meat, the real beauty sits in the 169 targets, of which a great many of them are sort of government focused, but it's a good education to sit there with your cup of coffee and go through the 189. And there are a lot of issue areas that don't necessarily link back in, or that these are all universal and interrelated. So for gender equality, in fact, I think there's 10 targets that actually sit under other goals that feed into the number 5, gender equality. So I think it's sort of taking it a layer down, conversations at a high level around the 17 goals, but sort of, I think for the practitioners, is sort of going down and getting a good understanding there. And then I think to the question around communication, I think we're all resource constrained, whether we're in the NGO world or, the lucky corporates out there that have very large teams. But in general, we all hear about the under-resourced challenge. So what better way than having a common language, common framework to share? Because I think there's so much time invested on branding strategies around CSR, on NGO missions, et cetera, that are often, they're targeted all over the place. If we're using this sort of common language, it makes for that easier dialogue. So if you've got a funder or a corporate that interfaces with you, you're immediately talking, or at least helps with that pathway to be talking a sort of common language. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. I'm wondering if we can get, I think it was the third slide, just the SDGs.
They're on the slide.
This one, perfect.
Slide.
So with TCS, we're using them in 2 ways. One is communication, as has been mentioned multiple times, and for us, it's communication internally and externally. So internally, it allows us to talk across geographies using the same language, same global language, but at a local narrative level as well. So I'll talk in a second about the Canadian lens that we're putting on this. But secondly, we're also using the SDGs for our strategic development and our partnership development within our CSR strategy. So when we looked at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we got very excited because all of our 3 pillars, health, planet, and education, seem to encompass a lot of the 17 goals up here. But when we did mapping of our actual activities this past year, if we go to the next slide, oh, it didn't work, shoot, okay. So technical difficulties, funny for an IT company, but, we found that we're actually only really significantly impacting goal number 2, 3, 4, and 8. And specifically, 47% of our resources and our human capital resources through our skills-based volunteer program are targeted at target 4.5. Now, this target specifically calls out equitable access to education, especially for vulnerable populations, and it specifically also calls out the Indigenous population. It's one of the only targets that actually does this, and we realized that a lot of our efforts, 47%, going in this area, and we have no coverage of that specific population. So what we are looking at right now, and so far in the past 10 months, we've done a lot of internal education, so I love the earlier comment about vulnerable populations. We are taking a step back, realizing that we don't know very much about this specific community. We've gone through Indigenous cultural competency training. We've also done a couple of other outreach activities with partners in the community, and we're having ongoing conversations of how can we bring our programming that we're already bringing to these other populations to Indigenous communities in a way that they want them, that they need them. And so we are having conversations about co-creation of content that we haven't had before. And it is, as somebody else said, it's a long process, relationship building process. But as we are running our other programs concurrently, we're meeting those quarterly or fiscal year metrics that we need with the long-term game of by 2030, we will also have impact in that area. I think without this mapping activity and realizing these metrics and numbers in front of us, we might not have specifically called out this population to work with. We're very excited, especially in the current environment in Canada for Americans. You can't really turn on the news without hearing about Indigenous communities reconciliation, and I know my colleague at IBM will talk about that in a second. But we're very excited about this new direction and very grateful that we had the opportunity through the SDGs to realize that we could have this impact.
Great, thanks. So yeah, when my slide comes up, as I said before, I got asked to create one slide that says, what do you do at IBM? And look at that, first point, Indigenous relations. So as I mentioned, we operate in 178 countries. We're based in New York, and to a bunch of the conversation that was going on in the previous conversations about how do the corporate people relate to the people in the not-for-profit sector and find common ground. And what I was thinking over there was the economist in me was going, this is a demand pull versus supply push sort of situation. And I think in a lot of cases, corporates are guilty of saying, nope, we're interested in X. We have a nice box around what we're interested in, and we go out to the community and try to shove X out into the community and are surprised when people on the other side of the table are not necessarily that interested in the X that we're selling philanthropically. But my background in manufacturing was actually in customization work. You can see our work in all kinds of retail places across Canada. And it was very much a demand pull. So my whole formative career at IBM was in trying to understand what was customers actually needed and actually building products to do that. And I've been able to bring that into the work that I now am able to do on our citizenship portfolio. And as it pertains to this first bullet on Indigenous relations, we've been at this for close to 20 years. I actually have a peer executive who is our Indigenous relations executive, and she and I spend a great deal of time together, and her job is essentially to coach the entire company as to what it means and the things that we are actually concerning ourselves with at the moment and taking a very long and thoughtful process on it are, do we take a position on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People? Do we say that publicly? Do we have to come up with a response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission item number 92, call to action number 92, which calls on business to participate in this. So we know we have to do it, but we have to take a thoughtful approach to how do we do that. And then we have to do all this in the context of a Canadian organization that plugs back into a global organization which has signed off on the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a lot of internal tension as to what this means. And you know, in deference to my American colleagues in particular, when I spout on about why Indigenous relations are so important to us in Canada, they often glaze over, frankly, and don't understand that. And so we have to deal with that sort of tension as well. So I'm giving a lot of play to that top bullet, but it really is one of the things that we are most concerned with in our footprint here in Canada. Now in the top, on this side of the chart, you'll see IBM Canada 100 logo. So on the 29th of November, we'll actually celebrate 100 years of incorporation here in Canada. And as a point of trivia, IBM actually originated here in Toronto in 1917. So the corporation, which is 106 years old, didn't become the IBM Corporation until 1924. But we're going through this process right now of celebrating and acknowledging this century and saying, you know, one of the things that we've never done as a company is acknowledge the territorial lands on which our business operations exist, and is now the time to do that. Our 100th in the context of Canada 100. And as Mary Jane, who's our Indigenous Relations Executive, has coached me that you get one shot at this the first time, and if you don't do it right, it's worse than not doing it at all. So which is why we're being so thoughtful about that. The other bullets on here, I think, you know, the guidance I was asked or given was just to try to map some of the things that we focus on here in Canada and how those relate to some of the other SDGs. So I think you can probably see intuitively where they fit, but I'll point out one other, which is the gender equality issue. IBM is well known in a lot of industry for the fact that we set a equal pay for work of equal value policy in 1947, and we hired our first, or promoted our first female vice president in 1941. So we've got a long legacy of that. But how it affects us here is in Canada, and Canada is one of the worst performing countries in the world as it pertains to women's participation in the technology industry. And when we think of what the true promise of diversity is in the long term, that's a big problem. And so we managed to bat a little bit above the industry average on that, but are still a long way from being good at that. And so we do a lot of investment there as well. I think I'll stop at that point.
Great, thank you.
We can actually just jump back to the general, there you go, that's great. And that was a great factoid about IBM. I did not know that, and I'm very impressed by that. And we'll now look that up. I'm more curious to know more. So Taproot Foundation is in an interesting place with a topic like this because we're an intermediary organization. So we focus a lot on what it means to bring stakeholders together to achieve the type of change or impact that needs to happen. So as I began mentioning before, our work is really in mapping. That's really where we've dug in and seen an opportunity to try to affect change against some of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll give one example in particular, which is goal number 2. There are obviously a tremendous number of companies who in particular are in a space that are well poised to have some pretty substantial impact on ending hunger and the different components that are within it. But what we found is when you are a company in that space, you sometimes kind of default to what might feel like the one or two obvious parts of that challenge where you can provide support. So you are a substantial consumer packaged goods or foods-based company, you're going to donate a lot of product. That's important, that helps. But you have assets beyond that product. And you also don't have to be a company who is in the food space to achieve some change and impact in this example, this particular goal. So part of what we set out to do in our own campaign now around this is in mapping the food value chain, mapping what the needs are there so that it is easier for companies and other institutions to more effectively identify the types of interventions or support that they can provide that will actually help make a difference against this. So you don't think just about, as I mentioned, getting access to product or to food, but what about cold storage? What about distribution so that the food can actually get to where it needs to get and actually last long enough to be able to be consumed properly? What about food waste and the impact that not addressing that issue can bring to bear? So that's what we're endeavoring to do, and we've begun to dig in with some partners and are looking for others, who want to dig in there as well. But there's a lot of power in being able to break something down into some more specific components. And that alone, I think, can really help unlock more potential for nonprofits and NGOs, for companies, for government groups, to better see the very actionable ways that they can be involved to have an impact and make a difference there. So that's where we see a lot of potential, and it means that there's basically no one in this room that's off the hook from being able to play a role there. Because when you do break it down, not just the goal itself, but more so what the different contributing factors are to the challenge that the goal is meant to address, that's where you see all the opportunities to be supported. So you're a massive tech company, great. Imagine what can be brought to bear when your technical solutions are able to make it so that the different sources of supply, the different distribution centers, the people on the ground in different markets are able to communicate better in real time to get what's needed from point A to point B. You don't have to be a food company to be able to have an impact there. And that's where we really live, is in that space.
Great. I now understand Allison's challenge from the last panel, because as you listen, instead of one question, you have about 30. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask one question of the panelists, and then we're going to throw it open to the audience, okay? And I'm going to start with you, Christine, so you can make sure you pay attention so you don't miss the question. What really struck me in the comments was this element of intentionality and thoughtfulness that the organizations and companies are going through in thinking about their place in community, their place in society, and either direct alignment or linkage to the SDGs. So I'm really curious as to how did that get started? What was the genesis in your company to go down this path in this process? Maybe Christine, if we can start with you, that would be great.
Absolutely. So TCS is a founding partner of Impact 2030. So we have been a part of the conversation from the beginning of the SDGs. And so we were trying to look at what we could do globally. But as we started looking globally, really when you get into the SDGs, you realize that the metrics that will prove whether or not these goals are achieved are all local, all national. And so we started looking more less company-wide, more country-wide. And for myself, it was a fantastic opportunity to come in as a Canadian, as somebody who's very eager to relate back to a global movement, but also have local impact, to see what we can be doing better. So one of the things that I found in the mapping was that we had so much of our resources going to this one target, and yet we were basically calling that target into jeopardy by not addressing the entire target itself. So it presented a great opportunity, but I do have to credit Impact 2030 with introducing us to the conversation.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in on this?
Sure. I'll come at it from a few different angles because I think you asked the question as why such a thoughtful approach, and carrying a business card for a big company like IBM gets you into a lot of places, but it also comes with a great deal of responsibility from a brand stewardship point of view. So as I said, there's a lot of thought goes into when you actually say something, people are going to pay attention, and you better get it right the first time, so you can't just go out willy-nilly and say you're interested in something, right? So there's the brand stewardship point of view. But I think deeper than that, as important as that is the certainly in our case, that's really part of our DNA. We've been one of the world's largest R&D companies for more than a century. We spend more than $6 billion a year on R&D, and that R&D is not in the area of, gee, let's go see what we can invent and then try to figure out how to sell it. It's very much from that demand pull point of view that I talked about of what are the world's great problems. That's where our R&D starts. And when we solve those problems through research, we know from a commercial point of view, we've already got a market for it. And so that informs every aspect of what we do, whether it be, commercial design or philanthropic citizenship approach. And so as we get into these goals from the SDGs, one of the challenges we find is the fact that, we're a 106-year-old corporation globally. We've got some, tradition, I'll call it, some ways of doing things that then have to be met with what are these new standards that a brand like IBM is going to be expected to participate in, and how do we move from how we do things and find that common ground that was talked about before in order to actually affect the right level of change and frankly to be able to portray the right level of participation and change in that. So it takes a very deliberate approach to figure that out, not something that you do in a day.
Yeah. So you have a bit of a Spider-Man approach. With great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I'll pick up an angle that came up with one of the questions before too, from the not-for-profit or NGO perspective. Not counting this campaign, a lot of organizations have had so many of these ephemeral campaigns come and go. Oh, okay, now enough funders are saying that I need to map against X, Y, and Z campaign, so every grant application is now going to somehow have to pitch how we make this certain widgety thing happen better. And there's a lot of that, and there's some exhaustion that comes with that, and it eats up time and resources, right? So I do think part of it at the outset of any new campaign or initiative for a not-for-profit organization is gauging what the staying power of it is, what the reach and relevance of it is, in addition to, of course, how does this actually relate to what I'm trying to accomplish, what my mission is, what we're looking to do. One of the things that I was so thrilled about when this work came to light and when we saw, what was going to be able to happen and with whom, is you have so many validating parties, the UN alone, let alone the other folks involved in the way this is able to come to life. And so I would therefore hope that with the right communication, with the right awareness, with the right discussion, and the evangelists that hopefully get created anytime these conversations happen, because I'm not letting anyone off the hook with anything today, that it can also help the organizations who are a part of tackling these challenges to have the confidence and comfort that it is worth the effort where relevant for organizations who aren't already obviously, aligned in here, to take a look at what they do and how it fits in. Because in reality, it would be hard for any mission-oriented organization to not, in some way, be doing something that contributes against a goal here. And so it's less probably about it being applicable and relevant and more about it being relevant enough for their day-to-day to pause and see how one can actually frame one's work through this lens. And I think having funders, partners, you name it, kind of stakeholders, help not only by posing that question, but by helping to paint the picture of how that can then be valuable and how that can make them part of an even bigger movement and perhaps hopefully gain access to even more resources and support by now being on the radar of institutions that are trying to help move the needle on these SDGs, that can help more organizations kind of map and align that way. Because again, I'd be hard-pressed to think of an organization with a mission-based focus that isn't in some way trying to achieve change against these.
One of the questions that came up at lunchtime was around, if I'm focused on my NGO or my company is focused on a specific goal, does that mean I can only play with other organizations in that that have that same level of focus? And I would say that was one of the journeys that we went through with Impact 2030 when we were looking at our impact projects. That were our first error of thinking was that we need to put companies together and NGOs that are focused on the same SDG. We found that actually it's really not consequential because we did a workshop recently to show this to our partners and stakeholders, in that we had them think through collaboratively on what they bring to the table through the human capital lens. And then we use the example of Los Angeles for no other reason other than all of the partners that were in the room had representation in Los Angeles. So we took the challenge of 45,000 homeless people in that city. The city government is very focused on that. And what might the people in the room, if they came together through an impact project, be able to contribute to that? So the first thing was that none of the companies had homelessness as part of their CSR strategy. However, going through this workshop, it was evident that the work that they are doing in the different areas all in some way were contributing, whether their focus is around food or poverty alleviation or job skills, that it played a role. So if we are, and we're hopeful for next year of creating this very large impact project collaborative, cross tri-sector collaborative, it also helps that movement where participants can, if it is scalable and sustainable, it's not an episodic project. We're going to do this today and then withdraw back to work. But if we're part of something that's addressing a critical issue in a community, then the company can figure, how can we play a role over what period of time? When do we come in and have to withdraw because of business demands? But you can set up this sort of longer-term path. But for us, it was really insightful that, in fact, it's sort of inconsequential. It's like the young lady had said before. Yes, so we're a children's organization, and we want. I think it might have been you. I don't necessarily need corporates that want to focus around kids, but maybe your focus is around gender equality. You want to help us help our female executives grow and develop. Help so bring those other skills. So it doesn't matter if you don't focus in on children or education, but you can help us so many other ways. So I think it's just sort of keeping that sort of broad spectrum of contribution.
So my question is for Lindsay. You threw out the comment saying that you think that this campaign of the Sustainable Development Goals is going to last for a long time. Why are you so hopeful about that? And you kind of threw that out and moved on, but I guess I'd just challenge you about why do you think this one's going to stick?
I'm used to not being too quiet, but I feel like the microphone is helpful here. Good question. And it's not just because 2030 is in the name and therefore I'm assuming this will last through that. these things have come and gone before, and in other areas and other sectors. So two parts, I think, to that answer in my mind. One is that while these things do not always correlate, unfortunately, I think when you look at the institutions that are involved and the level of external accountability and the level of external awareness and as a result, in some ways, vulnerability, that builds more accountability within it. So when campaigns kind of come and go in other arenas, it's often a group of institutions talking to themselves, which means that there are fewer factors to hold them accountable towards actually trying to accomplish something against that work. The only people that would have known if it worked or it didn't work would be that group of companies or whomever it is, and maybe a few of the nonprofits that tried to be a part of it or weren't able to be served. Exactly. And let me be clear in saying I think they are all well-intentioned, but there's a difference between intentions and then the thoughtful action that can bring them to life. And so the institutions that are associated with this, the fact that it's been from the get-go, obviously others have been added, but the fact that it started with commitment, something was baked a bit before it was rolled out. These are all things that I find tend to at least correspond to having more accountability and a greater likelihood of change being able to occur. Do I think hunger is going to be eliminated by 2030? I would love for that to be the case. I don't think it will be entirely eliminated by 2030, no. But to me, at least, personally, a big part of what is meant to happen through this is to be realistic, intentional, and thoughtful about what's actually needed and the space and time in which some real change can happen. If this had been Impact 2020, which I'm sure was maybe like a sexier, fun take, you can use 2020 and all this, I'd be more dubious. But the idea, right, that there was the thought behind having a bit of a runway, getting parties involved up front, and having a lot of external exposure, which in and of itself kind of engenders some accountability, in my mind, makes this much more likely to have some staying power. So a few thoughts at least.
And Sue, do you want to jump in on this? Yeah.
It's really to echo that, but I mean certainly there has been a slow start. We're already 2 years into the 17-year journey, but as you've said, all countries signed on and are required to report back. Now that reporting back isn't yet happening with all countries, but there is that annual requirement to show the progress that you're making as a nation. I think secondly, the other component is this sort of, we talk about the millennials. There is a large movement around the Sustainable Development Goals or the global goals. I mean, global citizen as the festival series, the celebrity, the sport. There is just this dialogue that's going on out there that is influencing and is starting to really engage. So I think now that there's been this focus today, I guarantee it happens when you learn a new word or you hear about it. It's something and then suddenly you hear it all the time. You are so going to be every day, SDGs, goodness me, they're starting to follow me around. You're going to start, you will pick up on the dialogue. I promise you that we're seeing a groundswell of focus that is going to increase over time. And we were not going to be Impact 2020. We were actually going to be the Global Initiative for the Advancement of Corporate Volunteering. How cool is that? Yeah, we're so pleased that we rebranded very quickly.
And the question surfaces a really interesting tension in the sense that, I would argue that we live in a world of new and zippy. When's the next product launch? When's the next election cycle? And yet this requires staying power. And I think there's an inherent tension there between the kind of society that we actually, at least in North America, reside in, and yet a requirement for success that has a longer lens. So it's a great question and great thoughts on this. Others, maybe Eric? I think we're right by, and then we'll come back this way.
Sue, you just touched on the reporting aspect of it, and just wondering from an outcomes perspective, do you feel that once you take a look at what private sector, civil society, government is doing, some of those outcomes can be looked at in the Canadian Wellness Index, and then you roll those results up to the SDGs, and then you can measure on a year-to-year basis what's really being moved in terms of high-level metrics?
It's a great question. There's so much happening out there. I mean, which is one of the challenges with the SDGs, sort of not just related to measurement, but there is just so much sort of siloed, and there's a big conversation about how do you pull that all together so it's not just sort of all this energy being expended. I don't know that I can really comment on that other than the role that Impact 2030 is playing specifically around human capital and focusing on sort of outputs, outcomes, and impact, and the long journey. I loved and I sent a note to myself because I'm going to use it all the time. But what gets measured gets done. In fact, what gets measured is easy to measure, and this is not going to be easy to measure and that's why nobody's done it before. So I think it's a long journey. I think of particularly for us, our focus areas, I think measurement, being able to address that, will be the last piece of the puzzle. So I don't really know that I have the answer there. And actually, when you talk about that index, the Canadian
Wellness Index.
Yeah, I'm going to have to send that note to myself because I'm going to have to read about that on the plane back because I'm sitting up here feeling very embarrassed. So maybe one of my Canadian colleagues can speak to that. So thank you for introducing me to that.
I'm not sure I can speak to the index itself, but in terms of the metrics, what we're finding at TCS is that it's a large exercise with the SDGs of sort of leaving company ego at the door, because the metrics themselves for each of the targets under each of the goals are actually national metrics. So if you look, for example, at target 3.4, just one of the metrics under that target is a decrease in the number of deaths caused by cardiovascular disease. There's no way that TCS, or really any company, can ensure that their impact is specifically targeting 3 less deaths every year because of X, Y, and Z. So a lot of what this conversation is also pushing forward, in my opinion, is collaboration between sectors, not only because now you have a common language to speak to one another about what are you driving towards, what is the impact you want, but also because we don't have things that other sectors do. Equally, they don't have certain skills or resources that we do. And so it is pushing forward collaboration and actually makes some of our partnership conversations easier. One of the partners that I'm thinking of right now is we work with a school board, and they've asked us to bring our expertise through our employee volunteers on the SDGs and design thinking into the professional development training that we're doing with their teachers. And that's something I don't think we would have seen even 2 years ago.
Great. Well, I
don't know if this is for one person or not, but I think and I know you've had examples where senior leadership is involved, but like going up to our CEO, like how do you really get them to buy into this? Because kind of to the point that's been made, these indices kind of come and go in these frameworks. And so like, getting their commitment to see where the value is.
So maybe I'm going to ask Dave, do you want to jump in on this, or Christina?
Well, I can tell an entertaining story about how you get your CEO involved. And this is in the Canadian context. I think I was telling Jen about this earlier when I arrived, that we've had this Indigenous Relations program going on for 15 years and sort of toiling away at it and getting support on it. But it was probably April of 2016 when there was another incident in Attawapiskat. And that Thursday morning in our board meeting, Dino, our president, came in and slammed the Globe and Mail down on the table and said, "Why can't we fix this problem?" And there we go. We had engagement. So he became interested in it right then and there. So, I mean, we sort of fluked our way into that one. But I think I've been very lucky over the course of my career to work in a place where executives are actually very thoughtful people, and they don't park their thoughtfulness at the door and become the corporate tyrants that was, somewhat described in one of the previous panels there. It's a little bit different. But the ability to demonstrate business value is critical in that sort of engagement. And I think also there's a sweeping change happening in the corporate world that's frankly a generational change that's going on. There's a whole bunch of people retiring and a whole bunch of new people ascending to levels of leadership now that think differently about their place in the world. So there was another question earlier about why do we think this thing's going to have legs, and I don't have the science to back it up, but I've got a great deal of faith because 60% of the company I work for are people who've been with us for less than 5 years, and they don't stop chewing my ear off about we need to do more faster to fix things. So
I don't know. Okay, I'm looking at the timekeepers here. Okay.
I think also for CEOs, there is a movement. I mean, you look at organizations like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. You look at the role that someone like Paul Pullman at Unilever or Jack Ma now at Alibaba, who are a position now as UN SDG commissioners and champions. They've got a number of titles. That dialogue is happening, and I think for CEOs, when they start to see the brand positioning as well as the good work these companies are doing, but there's that opportunity to really, for the companies that are moving now, definitely to really define a space, a leadership space for their organizations. So I imagine that your CEOs will start to hear about it, and then obviously, the uplift from, the CSR group to, to provide that education. So also they're not turning up in forums and get blindsided with what are the SDGs. I mean, there's an obligation to make sure our business leaders really understand and can articulate an answer if they're on a panel as to what the SDGs are. So at least, they even if they're not fully immersed in it, that they really can start to have that conversation. But again, I see that the majority of the 1,200 people in the General Assembly Hall were CEOs of companies, Canadian companies, US companies, companies from India that were there. Where the dialogue is going to be there. It's just going to take a little bit of time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not sure that was a fluke. I think that was a human response. And I often hear in the charitable sector, fundraisers and those of us who seek partnerships referring to the private sector as companies and corporations, and yet they're populated by mums and dads and aunts and uncles and grandmoms and granddads. And I think that human connection to real causes and what's happening in their communities is part of that gateway to this conversation. So as we wrap things up, thank you for your thoughtful questions and participation. Thank you to the panelists for all your insight. And I have to say, as someone who's worked in the charitable sector for 30 years, I'm really heartened to hear the level of thought and discourse thinking about societal issues. Because I really subscribe to what Alison had to say before, and I think it's a philosophy that Stephanie and her team share, which is this isn't about one sector achieving solutions, because no sector is large enough to do it. It's working together, and so thank you for convening this conversation. I think it's a wonderful exploration of this topic. So thanks to our panelists.